Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual field days. Today we're going to be talking about the many corn trials that we have up here at Borderview Farm. I think often, actually, at our annual field days, by the time we get to the corn, it's almost lunchtime, and it often gets overlooked. So today I wanted to talk a bit about all the different production, agronomic, and variety trials that we do up here at the farm and the importance of those. So I think everybody knows it's been a really exceptionally dry and hot July and now August. I believe it's been the hottest, maybe driest July on record, at least where we are in Vermont. And hot and dry weather can have many benefits, but it certainly can also have many downfalls. I think we all know that crops require heat and sunlight to grow, but they also require water. And at our last virtual field day, the corn was pollinating. It was actually probably a little bit past peak pollination. And I was talking about the importance of water during the flowering period of corn. So essentially from the time of tasseling, the tasseling dropping pollen onto the silks receiving the pollen growing a germ tube and growing down the pollen or down the silk tube and pollinating each potential kernel on the ear of corn. If there's water stress and also heat stress during that time, it can have a huge impact on yield. And I feel like we were actually just lucky enough to receive some timely moisture from the tropical storm that blew through to at least save pollination on our corn. And I've been out evaluating the different corn trials, looking at pollination, and overall for most of our trials it looks pretty good. And you know, where we see good pollination is that every one of these kernels is full, is filling, and is also almost to the tip. So remember I said the silk is the female part of the plant and the tassel shedding the pollen is the male part of the plant. Each silk is connected to a kernel on the corn. So that each silk has to receive a pollen granule that has to germinate and basically grow down that silk tube to fertilize and produce a kernel. So when you see missing kernels on an ear of corn, usually we see them at the tip. It means that they weren't fertilized, that those silks were not receptive to the pollen, or there wasn't enough pollen available at that time. The first silks actually emerge from the base of the corn ear. So those are the ones that will kind of peek out of the top of the husk first. And they're usually the first ones to receive pollen. And usually we don't see any missing kernels at the bottom of the ear unless we have some real severe weather issues or nutrition issues. And then as the plant matures, the silks start to grow from the top kernels. And those are the last ones to get fertilized. So that's often why we see the tip of the ear of corn not always full. But this actually isn't too bad considering how dry it's been. You can see that there were some kernels that were not fertilized, but for the most part it looks okay. So one of the things that we look at Borderview Farm are different agronomic practices, and what we're really interested in recently is plant population. Kind of seems like old news that we should have figured out optimum plant populations for corn silage in Vermont and the Northeast. And I think just like anything else, our recommendations, our viewpoints, our climate is always changing. And that means the way we view agronomy also changes. And what I'm really interested in, and it'll be interesting to see how the corn performs, and I'll show you some ears in a minute, is given the fact that we've had such a dry year, what plant population do we think is going to do the best in a dry year? And that's probably, you're answering that question Well, of course, the less plants per acre, the less competition for nutrients and moisture. But how does that impact the overall yield? And we want to understand how corn population impacts yield and quality, and also how it impacts interseeding of cover crops. So we're looking at it from a slightly different angle than in the past. If we lower our plant populations of corn, can we maintain high yields and quality while also improving the establishment of our cover crops? And we talked about this a bit a few weeks ago as well, but we were looking at row spacing. Now I'm talking about population. Now this year, having a low population may actually end up helping your yield quite a bit because there's less plants in a time when there's not a lot of moisture. The other thing we're evaluating is this concept or characteristic of corn that we haven't heard about all that much. We're hearing about it more, this flex ear versus fixed ear corn hybrids. And corn hasn't traditionally been marketed as, do you want a flex ear variety or a fixed ear variety? But that, I think, is starting to change. And out in this field, actually in front of the camera, are a variety of fixed and flex ear varieties grown at different plant populations and interseeded with cover crops. So again, can we select ear types, plant characteristics, and also manage agronomics like plant spacing to maximize yield under a changing climate and under conservation practices like cover crops? So if you're not familiar with fixed ear versus flexed ear, fixed ear variety should produce consistent ear size across different plant populations. So the ear size will adapt to the amount of competition it's grown under, okay? So it also means that it's a little bit less drought tolerant. They tend to have an upright leaf architecture, which means it may let in more sunlight for the cover crop. They may have more narrow, woodier stems, and you can grow more plants per acre and hopefully get more yield per acre as well. And these may be varieties that are more profitable at higher seeding rates, but again, we'll see. A flex ear variety has variable ear size across different plant populations. It tends to have wider and more digestible stems, can utilize extra resources to increase yield, but more plants per acre generally means less yield per acre. So these are varieties that are more profitable at lower seeding rates. And again, if we're planting lower seeding rates to integrate cover crops and maximize moisture in this case, these may be the type of varieties that we want to grow. So we'll be showing you the results of that research in our research reports once the corn is harvested this fall. So what else are we doing with corn? We have a very extensive variety trial. This doesn't show you that in particular, but we've been working with Cornell, Penn State, and Vermont to host a long season and a short or medium season corn variety evaluation program across 3 different states and many locations. We're testing over 100 varieties of corn, and we're looking at both yield but also silage quality. And I think the important take-home message here is that variety evaluation is critical, and looking at varieties across a number of locations is also really important. So you can just see here the sort of orange cluster, blue cluster, gray cluster in these graphs. And what I want you to notice is that these clusters actually correspond with location, environment. So you can see that varieties performed really different at different varieties or at different environments. So again, it's really important for us to trial the same varieties in different locations, in different years, so that you as farmers can make good variety selection for the soils that you have and the climate that you have. And again, we'll talk more about this when we have our in-person time this Friday. But just to put that out there. One of the components that we're looking at more is the undigestible NDF, the UNDF, and this is kind of a new term that has come onto the forage scene in the past, I guess it's probably been about 4 years or so. So we're trying to understand how much of the fiber is actually not digestible in these corn crops. And this is really important because the more digestible fiber there is in the corn, as well as starch, the better feed it is for your animals, the more that they'll get out of that feed. And you can see hybrids may produce the same yields as in the case of these two hybrids, but the amount of digestible fiber is really different, and how quickly an animal digests that fiber changes depending on the variety. And this can be hugely significant when you're feeding animals. So we'll talk about this a little bit more again when we're meeting in person on Friday. Just wanted to give you a glimpse into some of the research that we're doing here up at Borderview with corn. And I'll just mention before we leave, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago as well, is if you're planning on planting winter terminated cover crops, now is the time if you haven't already done so. So if you want to get some oats planted, either as a cover crop or late fall feed, get them in the ground now. You can see this is the 24th of August planting date, and these are the yields that we saw on those oats, and in this case oats, clover, and turnip in October. So you can produce a couple of tons of dry matter from these cool season feeds. And I know a lot of people are short on feed this year, so get those oats and peas or clover in the ground, and hopefully you'll get a little extra feed. All right, let's take a look at some corn ears. These are from different populations that we have out in the cornfield. And I want you to notice this particular ear that obviously had some issues with pollination. You can see that these are already denting, which means right now there's not enough moisture for these kernels to fill, okay? And these didn't pollinate at all, any of these kernels here. And you can see in general the ear is much smaller and less robust than this ear or this ear as well. So this ear came out of really high population silage corn that we were growing. So these plants are grown at over 40,000 plants per acre. And you can see how much smaller the ear is. And also the issues that we're having with pollination, likely because there's so many plants packed into an acre. There was way too much competition for moisture amongst these plants in a year like this. And these are ears that are coming out of populations ranging from 28,000 to 32,000. So in a really dry year like we're having right now, plant population could make a big impact on the final yield and quality of the corn that we're going to be harvesting. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good week.